Santiago was 7 years old, but he had a tired look in his eyes that didn't match his age. Ever since he had run away from the public orphanage, where the silence of abandonment was mixed with the muffled screams of the other boys, he had wandered the streets of Zapopan like a shadow too small to be noticed. The body, already thin by nature, was now pure bone and skin, covered in dust and marks from falls. His knees were always sore, and his shoes, 2 sizes too big, squeaked as they dragged on. The wet ground. That night, Santiago had eaten nothing but a piece of moldy bread that he had found near the bus station, and the cold entered through the holes in the torn blouse as if it had hands. He walked slowly, kicking pebbles, until he stopped in front of a house like he had never seen before. Tall, white, with a shiny black gate and cameras fixed to every corner. It looked like a castle, but no music, no laughter, no light. Before continuing, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Here you will find real and transformative stories like this one, told with the care they deserve. He stood there, his stomach growling and his chin quivering. No windows lit, no car in the garage, just the sound of the wind and the muffled echo of a city that seemed far away. He thought about leaving, but he had nowhere else to go. His eyes fell on the intercom. I've never played one before. He didn't know if an alarm would sound or if a puppy would appear and bite his feet. But at that moment, fear was less than hunger. He pressed the button with his dirty hand, his finger hesitant. A metallic sound filled the silence. He took a step back. He waited. Nothing. I was about to turn my back when a hoarse voice came over the speaker, low and suspicious. "Who's there?" Santiago did not respond. The throat got stuck. But he stood there, quiet, his eyes fixed on the intercom, as if silence were answer enough. On the other end of the line, the person squinting to see the camera's viewfinder was Teresa, hair tied in a loose bun, beige lab coat, and hands still damp from freshly washed dishes. That skinny, shrunken boy activated something in her that she couldn't explain. It wasn't just pity. It was as if time had stopped for a few seconds, and an echo from the past invaded the present. Teresa had been taking care of the Balmori household for over 30 years. He saw Ernesto marry Lucia, the discreet and intense young woman he had met at university. He witnessed the birth of Nicolas and also his sudden death 3 years ago in a silly bicycle accident that turned into a tragedy. Since then, Ernesto has not smiled. It just existed. The white mansion had become an elegant mausoleum, where life was maintained only by inertia and by Teresa, who cleaned, watered, and cooked automatically. When she saw Santiago on camera, something snapped in her. "Wait a moment," he said into the intercom, and unlocked the gate. The boy entered as if he were invading a temple. His eyes slowly rolled, mapping every detail: the black stone path to the door, the smell of living plants, the discreet creak of the old wood. Teresa was waiting for him with a plate in her hand. White rice, 2 fried eggs, and a piece of warm bread. Nothing special, but there that night, it felt like a banquet. Santiago sat on the edge of the step, never taking his eyes off her. He ate slowly, as if he was afraid of finishing. Teresa stayed close by, but didn't say anything. She didn't want to scare him. When he finished, he just said thank you in the lowest voice she had ever heard. Then he put the plate down and stood up. Teresa bent down, picked up the plate, and, without thinking, said, "If you need to, you can come back." He didn't answer, but she knew he would. The next morning, Teresa made a cursory comment to Ernesto over coffee. He was reading the newspaper as usual, sitting at the head of the table, his face buried in the headlines and his cup of coffee forgotten. Beside him, yesterday a boy showed up at the gate. He must have been about 7 years old at most. Ernesto didn't even look up. "And did you call the police?" he asked in a mechanical tone, more out of protocol than out of real concern. "No, I gave him food." Teresa's dry answer made Ernesto finally raise his head. His tired eyes, always dull, met hers with a touch of disguised irritation. "Teresa, this isn't a shelter." "I know," she replied, calmly picking up the crumbs from the table. But hunger is hunger, and he seemed lost. Ernesto sighed, went back to the newspaper, and the subject dropped there. But for Teresa, something had begun to move inside. An intuition that didn't come from logic, but from memory. In the days that followed, Santiago returned. I never knocked on the gate. He would just show up, sit on the same step, and wait. Teresa already left food ready, as if it wasn't on purpose. Sometimes she would leave a plate on the table on the balcony, as if she had just forgotten it there by accident. And he ate, always in silence, always with clean hands, as if that moment was sacred. Never asked for more, never came in, never touched anything. I just looked, the garden, the windows, the details on the walls. Ernesto pretended not to see. When he passed one of the windows and saw the boy outside, he looked away. But one night, when she turned off the lights in the hallway, she stopped for a moment in front of the living room window and saw him. There, sitting in the dark, staring at the sky. He didn't have the courage to interrupt. He just stared from a distance, as if trying to understand what he still doesn't know how to name. One afternoon, while tidying up the pantry, Teresa found an old cardboard box full of yellowed papers and forgotten objects. It was from the time when Lucia was still alive. It contained everything from paid bills to carefully kept children's drawings. Among them was a sheet of paper folded in four, with a colored pencil drawing of a woman with long hair holding a child next to a building with a red cross, the Guadalajara General Hospital. Teresa frowned. She didn't remember Nicholas drawing that. On the back of the sheet, in shaky letters, she could read, "Mommy and I, the day I waited for you." That didn't make sense. Whose drawing was that? She kept the sheet of paper with her, feeling a shiver in her stomach. That same night, Santiago showed up again. And for the first time, Teresa sat next to him while he ate. "Do you have a family, my boy?" she asked. He chewed slowly without looking at her. Then he shook his head slightly. "There was a girl who would take me to the hospital sometimes. She said my name was Santiago. Then she disappeared." Teresa didn't insist. But that night, she went to sleep with the feeling that she was facing something she could no longer ignore. The next day, he went to the old closet in Ernesto's office, where the family documents were kept. He went through folders, envelopes, medical reports, all with the care of someone who knows every inch of that house. He found a hospitalization receipt in the name of Lucia Balmori, dated close to her death. The detail is that there was reason for admission, gestational complications. This disoriented her. Lucia had never said anything about a new pregnancy. Teresa remembered well the mourning for Nicholas, Lucia's isolation in the following months, the way she avoided any visits, even from her own mother-in-law. And then came that sudden trip to Guadalajara under the pretext of taking care of my head. She died on that trip, alone. The official version was cardiac arrest, but no certificate was forthcoming. Just the body, just the pain. Teresa took a deep breath. He closed the closet, swallowed his anxiety, and decided he was going to find out the truth. Ernesto didn't react well when Teresa confronted him. They were in the kitchen late at night, and he had just turned off the coffee. "Maker, did you know that Lucia was pregnant when she died?" she asked directly, holding the hospital slip between her fingers. He stared at her for a second, then looked away, as if he'd been slapped in the face by an invisible slap. "This is crazy." Teresa didn't answer. She put the slip on the table and pushed it toward him. "Do you really think it's too much of a coincidence? The boy appears out of nowhere, with Lucia's features, the right age, and a name she could have chosen. He said his mother took him to the hospital." Ernesto remained silent. He ran his hands over his face, tired, tense. "Lucia, she didn't talk much after Nicholas left. I thought grief had silenced everything, but maybe she tried to spare me, or spare herself." The words came out with difficulty, as if they were costing her dearly. Teresa sat across from him, her hands clasped together. "Ernesto, this boy could be your son." For the first time in a long time, he had no answer. In the following days, Ernesto began to observe Santiago with different eyes. Without admitting it, he started to check the camera to see when the boy appeared. One night, he saw him drawing with a piece of charcoal on the floor of the porch. He drew houses, trees, faces that seemed familiar. One of them, in particular, kept Ernesto awake at night. A man in a suit with a dog by his side, very similar to him and the late Max, the Labrador who had died years ago. Teresa, firm in her decision, scheduled a DNA test. Without telling the boy anything, she collected strands of Santiago's hair while he slept on the couch on the porch. It was the first time he had agreed to rest there. She also took an old brush of Ernesto's that she kept for cleaning. She took the materials to the city laboratory and waited. Waiting in this case was the hardest part, because if the result was correct, nothing would ever be the same again. The envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Teresa held it in her hands for several minutes before opening it. The paper was shaking, but not from the cold. It was something else, fear of being right. Ernesto was in the living room, looking out the window, oblivious to the sound of the TV showing some documentary. When Teresa came in, he noticed the strange silence. She didn't say anything, she just held out the envelope. He took it hesitantly. He opened it slowly, as if he were about to dig up a corpse from the past. He read it again, and only then did he sit down. "It's my son," he murmured. The sentence didn't seem to fit properly in his mouth. Teresa nodded, unsurprised. Lucia had this boy all by herself, and no one knew. The rain outside was getting heavier. Ernesto rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the ground. She died with this thing inside, and now he's there, alive, and I don't even know what to do. Teresa watched him. "You don't have to do anything now. Just don't push him away." Ernesto didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. In the weeks that followed, Santiago kept coming back. Teresa now called him inside, first for a snack, then to rest. Little by little, he began to accept her. He chose a corner of the sofa, then the armchair, and one night he slept right there, wrapped in a plaid blanket. Ernesto kept his distance, but he no longer pretended not to see. One day, as he passed by the living room, Santiago handed him a drawing. It was a tree with two people sitting underneath, one small, the other large, both with neutral faces but hands that touched. Ernesto held the paper up, not knowing what to say. "I made it for you," the boy said, before returning to the sofa. The phrase echoed in Ernesto's head for the rest of the night. That "for you" had a weight he didn't know how to carry, but he also didn't want to let go. It was the beginning of something he didn't understand yet, but that, in some way, was already changing him. So, what do you think of this story? Comment below what touched you the most so far. Your opinion makes all the difference to us. Ernesto began to change slowly, almost without realizing it. First was the habit of leaving the living room door unlocked when it got dark, as if he was expecting someone. Then he started putting an extra plate on the dinner table without even admitting that it was for the boy. Teresa, always attentive, noticed everything and didn't comment on anything. The bond between the two grew without fanfare, but it was there. One afternoon, Santiago appeared with a runny nose and red eyes. He said it was just the wind, but Teresa soon realized it was a fever. Ernesto offered to take him to the health center, something she didn't expect to hear. In the car, the silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. Santiago looked out the window as if he had never been in a car like that. Ernesto looked at him in the rearview mirror, trying to identify what was his there, the shape of his eyes, maybe the way he scratched his chin. When he thought. After the appointment, they stopped at the bakery. Ernesto asked him what he liked to eat, and Santiago replied, "Anything that tastes like home." That hit him hard. They bought bread, milk, and a small box of butter cookies. On the way back, Santiago dozed off in the passenger seat, his head resting against the door. Ernesto drove slowly, as if he wanted to extend the journey. When he got home, he picked him up, hesitantly but firmly. Teresa saw everything through the window and felt her eyes fill up. That night, Santiago slept in the guest room. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a tomb. The hallway sounded like footsteps, the stove smelled like warm milk, and there were drawings scattered around the living room. Ernesto still didn't call Santiago his son, but he started calling him by his name, and in that context, it was more than he had called anyone in years. The following days brought small revolutions. Santiago began asking questions about the books on the shelves, the old photos, and even the rusty bicycle at the bottom of the garden. Ernesto at first responded with short, almost automatic sentences, but over time, the answers turned into stories. He told us about Lucia, about Nicholas, about a trip they took to the sea when their son was still young. Santiago listened to everything with the attention of someone who records every word. One day, he pointed to a black and white photo of a young Lucia, hanging in a forgotten hallway. "She looks like me, doesn't she?" Ernesto stopped. He took a deep breath. Yes, it seems so. It was the first time he admitted out loud what his heart had known for a long time. Teresa, hearing that from the kitchen, leaned her back against the wall and closed her eyes. It was as if a door had been opened. Santiago still didn't call Ernesto father, and perhaps he didn't even know if he could, but he began to follow him around the house with the naturalness of someone who feels safe. In the morning, I waited for coffee next to him. In the afternoon, I helped him water the plants even though I was awkward. One time, while cleaning out one of the closets in the living room, he found a photo frame with an old picture of Nicholas. Messy hair and a wide smile. He stared at it for a while, then asked, "Was he nice?" Ernesto sat on the sofa. "He was the best brother you could have had." The sentence came out without pain, as if, for the first time, it was possible to talk about Nicholas without his absence crushing everything. Santiago said nothing. She just put the picture back and sat down next to him. The two of them stood there in silence. But in that silence, there was company, and that was all they ever lacked. If this moment moved you, leave a like on the video. This is how we understand that these stories must continue to be told. Teresa observed everything with the care of someone watching a shoot growing after a harsh winter. She knew the road to get there had been long and would still be. Ernesto, even allowing himself more, still carried too many ghosts in his eyes. Sometimes at night, she would find him in the office, going through Nicolas's things, as if he needed to silently apologize to the son he had lost for taking so long to see what was right there. Santiago, in turn, was light, but had invisible marks. I had nightmares from time to time. He would wake up gasping for air, calling for the hospital lady, and would only calm down with a glass of water and the light on. Ernesto began to understand these moments, and even without knowing what to say, he learned to stay by his side. Just being there was a form of care that Santiago had never known. One Saturday afternoon, while they were organizing the old library cabinet, Santiago found a case of crayons. His eyes lit up. Teresa took sheets of paper and spread them out on the table. "Draw us a picture." He drew silently, focused, as if it were a mission. First, he drew a tree with wide branches, then 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a child. In the sky, a cloud with a discreet smile. "This is my new drawing," he said. "This is me, Mr. Ernesto, and the girl in the photo." Ernesto approached slowly. He looked at the drawing and felt a lump in his throat. "Is this cloud here Lucia?" he asked. Santiago nodded. "She's happy because we're together now." Teresa had to leave the room to hold back her tears. Ernesto stroked the boy's head and said with a choked voice, "I think she would be." And he stayed there, looking at that paper as if he were seeing his own life reorganized in lines of wax. After that drawing, something changed between them. Santiago started calling Ernesto Uncle, which drew a slight smile from Teresa and an indecipherable expression from Ernesto. He wasn't Dad, but he wasn't a stranger either. The treatment conveyed affection, and that was what mattered. Ernesto, in turn, started including the boy in his little routines. He took him to the market, asked him to help him choose fruit, let him put coins in the soda machine. Simple things, but for Santiago, they were big. It was like discovering the world with someone by his side. someone who wasn't going to disappear. At night, they sat down to watch TV. One day, Santiago fell asleep, leaning on his shoulder. Ernesto didn't move for almost an hour, afraid of breaking that moment. And when the boy snored softly, he closed his eyes and smiled without realizing it. Teresa brought a box of clothes down from the attic one night. Clothes that belonged to Nicolas and had been stored for years. "Maybe they'll fit him," he said, placing the box in the room. Ernesto remained silent, but did not stop him. Santiago, curious, opened it carefully. He took out a navy blue shirt, looked at Ernesto and asked if he could wear it. Ernesto nodded. The shirt was a little loose, but he put it on anyway and twirled around the room like a magical suit of armor. "I liked it," he said, smiling. Teresa, from the hallway, wiped her eyes once more. By then, I had lost count of how many times I had needed to leave the room to breathe. It wasn't just emotion. It was the realization that despite everything, life still insisted on flourishing there. Even where before there was only pain, there was now room to start over. And that was more than any miracle. Over time, Ernesto began to share little pieces of his story with Santiago. He didn't speak easily, but he told us little by little about the school he studied at, about the puppy he had when he was a child, about the day he asked Lucia to marry him during an improvised picnic in a park. Santiago listened to everything with that curious and attentive look, as if he were putting together a puzzle. And, without realizing it, Ernesto began to include the boy in the memories that previously hurt. "We could go to that park one day, right?" suggested Santiago, after hearing the story of the picnic. Ernesto, after a moment of silence, replied, "Yes, I could," and that yes was more than an agreement. It was a break from mourning, a permission to move forward without forgetting. One Sunday morning, they decided to go on the trip. Teresa prepared a basket with sandwiches, juice, and fruit. Santiago wore the same navy blue shirt, now a little tighter after Teresa had sewn it. They drove with the windows open, the wind messing up their hair. In the park, Santiago ran, climbed trees, and threw rocks into the lake. Ernesto watched from afar with a slight smile. At one point, the boy came running back out of breath and said, "Uncle Ernesto, look at the picnic bench." It was just an old wooden bench, but for the two of them, that was the point where everything began to change. They sat there, shared the sandwiches, and laughed at a cheeky pigeon that tried to steal a grape. Teresa, who stayed home, received a photo on her cell phone, the two of them together on the bench, with the caption, "Today was a colorful day." She smiled to herself, holding the cell phone as if she were holding a precious secret. The nights became different too. Santiago now slept in a room of his own, with a new bed, a moon-shaped lampshade, and a blanket that Teresa insisted on sewing by hand. Ernesto read to him a few times, his voice still harsh but present, and the boy loved it. I asked questions in the middle of the story. I wanted to know if dragons really existed, or if the world had someone who controlled the wind. Ernesto, without having all the answers, responded as best he could, with patience. It was as if the act of caring had relearned how to inhabit her body. Teresa, always close by, made sure that no detail went unnoticed. He left notes in their improvised lunchboxes, scolded them when necessary, but also left them alone when he noticed they needed space to figure things out on their own. One day, Santiago came home from school, now enrolled in a public school in the neighborhood, with a note attached. To his backpack, it was an invitation to the Family Day presentation. When he handed the paper to Ernesto, he was silent, as if testing something. Ernesto read and nodded. "We'll be there," he replied. Santiago smiled with relief, with a sparkle in his eyes that Teresa had never seen before. That day, she prepared a special snack, and the three of them ate together on the balcony, like a family making plans. Sometimes, silence still appeared. Sometimes, Ernesto got lost in his own thoughts. But now, there was more presence than absence. And when Teresa turned off the lights in the house, it was no longer just out of habit. It was a sign that the day had been worth it. And each night that ended in peace was an achievement that previously seemed impossible. The day of the presentation arrived. Santiago was nervous, wearing a white shirt and new sneakers that Ernesto had bought a few days before without telling him. At school, the playground was full of parents, grandparents, and older siblings. Santiago was looking for something in the crowd until he saw Ernesto and Teresa sitting in the second row. When he saw them, he let out a breath that seemed to have been holding in since breakfast. When it was his turn, he went up on the improvised stage and read a short text written by the teacher. Family is who stays when everything else disappears. It is who appears when no one else appears. My family has an uncle who takes care of me, a lady who makes the best bread in the world, and a cloud that smiles in the sky. Ernesto could not contain his emotion. The applause came quickly, but he remained still, trying to process what he had heard. Teresa, at his side, held his hand. He talked about you. On the way home, the car was silent. Santiago looked out the window, as usual, but with a slight smile hidden in the corner of his mouth. Ernesto, driving, suddenly said, "You can call me Dad, if you want." Santiago turned his head slowly. He didn't say anything right away. He just stared. Then, as if responding with his whole body, he reached out and grabbed Ernesto's arm. That was enough. When they got home, they went straight to the kitchen. Teresa had dinner almost ready, and they helped set the table. The three of them sat together, and when Santiago asked to pray before the meal, Teresa and Ernesto looked at each other. It wasn't customary, but no one thought it was strange. The boy thanked them for the food, for the house, and for the new dad who isn't so new, after all. And then, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, they began to eat. From that day on, Santiago never slept again, feeling like he could be sent away at any moment. He started leaving his toys scattered around the house, leaving his shoes at the door and running through the hallways without fear. Teresa said that it was the noise of a living house, and Ernesto, even pretending to grumble, accepted it in silence. One afternoon, while cleaning the bookshelf, Santiago knocked over a frame that contained a photo of Nicholas. He was desperate, thinking that Ernesto was going to fight, but the man crouched down, calmly picked up the pieces, and said, "We'll fix it together." Then he took the boy to the local store to choose a new frame. Santiago chose a blue one, which stood out from the others. "Because that way, it draws more attention," he explained. When they hung the new version on the wall, Teresa commented, "Now it looks like he's back in the living room." And it was true. That photo, with a blue frame, had a different presence. Over time, Santiago also began to tell his stories. Little by little, he revealed what he remembered about the orphanage, the cold nights, the hospital girl who took care of him and disappeared. Teresa mentally wrote down every name, every detail, and looked for clues as if it were still possible to find answers. But it wasn't out of a need for justice. It was out of respect for the memory of the woman who, even alone, brought Santiago into the world. Ernesto, in turn, listened to everything without interrupting, without trying to correct or understand too much. He just listened, which, for the boy, was already a rare and valuable gesture. In one of these conversations, Santiago said, "I think my mother wanted me to find you." Ernesto responded with a sigh and a caress of the boy's hair. "I think we needed to find you too." And there, in that moment, the past seemed to finally find some kind of peace. The walls of the house, previously marked by the silence of mourning, now bore crayon marks, colored cutouts stuck with tape, and even clay footprints left by Santiago on rainy days. Teresa, always methodical when it comes to cleaning, started leaving some dirt here and there. "There are some things that are good dirt," he said. Ernesto also allowed himself small breaks from routine. He started cooking on Sundays, even though he had no experience. The pancakes came out crooked. The eggs, sometimes, broke outside the bowl, but Santiago gave a standing ovation as if he were an award-winning chef. One of those Sundays, Teresa found the two with flour on their faces, laughing loudly as they fought over who could crack an egg with just one hand. And he thought, with a light heart, that he never imagined seeing that man like that again. So present, so relaxed, so human. One morning, as she was leaving for work, Teresa saw Santiago leaning against the gate, looking at the sky. "What are you waiting for, boy?" he replied without turning around. "I'm waiting for my mother to send a sign." Teresa approached and stood next to him. "And what would that sign be?" Santiago thought for a moment and said, "A yellow butterfly landing on my hand." Teresa smiled sadly. "I think it might take a while." But deep down, she wanted to see that butterfly too. That same week, when he came back from school, Santiago ran in and called Ernesto and Teresa to the garden. There was a yellow butterfly, small, almost faded, landing on the fence. He slowly extended his hand, and for a brief second, the insect rested there before flying away. "She came," he whispered. Neither of them knew what to say, but in that silence, they understood everything. The routine at home no longer seemed temporary. Santiago now had tasks. He fed the plants with Ernesto, helped Teresa sort the vegetables, and carefully placed the cutlery on the table. He received a new pencil case for his school supplies, a backpack with his name embroidered on it, and even a toothbrush left next to the sink as a sign of permanence. Ernesto installed a shelf just for his books and hung a blackboard on the bedroom wall where Santiago could write phrases of the day. The first one he put was, "This is my home now." Teresa took the picture without him noticing. He spent the night looking at that image on his cell phone. It was just a white wall with crooked letters and a backpack thrown on the floor. But to her, it was the most beautiful scene the house had seen in years. One autumn afternoon, Santiago showed up with an unusual request. He wanted to visit the cemetery where Nicolas was buried. Ernesto froze for a few seconds, then nodded. They brought white flowers. The boy walked in silence among the tombstones, holding his father's hand tightly. When he got there, he looked at the grave with respectful curiosity. "Can he see us now?" he asked. Ernesto answered in a low voice, "I think so." Santiago crouched down, put down the flowers, and took a folded drawing from his pocket. It was the same one of the tree, now with more detail. Two boys holding hands under the same branch. "That's him, and that's me." Teresa, further back, cried silently. Ernesto couldn't speak. He knelt down next to his son and put his arm around his shoulders. Standing there on that cold ground, with the weight of loss and the warmth of a new beginning at the same time, was the hardest and most right thing he had ever done. After that visit, Santiago began to ask more about Nicolas. I wanted to know what he liked, if he was messy, if he laughed out loud. Ernesto, little by little, opened the drawers of his memory. He showed pictures, told stories, some funny, some painful. Teresa also contributed, revealing episodes from Nicolas's childhood that not even his own father remembered. Santiago listened to everything with the care of someone putting together an album with delicate pieces. One of those nights, Ernesto found him sitting on the floor in the hallway drawing. It was a scene that mixed everything. Nicolas, Lucia, Teresa, himself, and Ernesto, all together in a room with open windows and an exaggerated sun in the sky. "This is my family," he said. Ernesto knelt down beside him and stared at the drawing. "Can I keep this one?" Santiago thought for a moment and replied, "You can, but leave it where I can see it too." The following Sunday, Teresa bought a frame and hung the drawing on the living room wall, right next to the old wedding photo of Ernesto and Lucia. When Ernesto saw it, he said nothing. He just stood there, staring. That house, which was once as silent as a wake, now had laughter after lunch, footprints on the floor, mixed voices. Santiago would soon have a birthday, and for the first time, he would have a party. Teresa had already planned everything. Chocolate cake, guaraná, brigadeiro, a colorful tablecloth on the table. Ernesto pretended not to be involved, but he searched for gifts on his cell phone at night. Santiago just wished everyone was there. "Even Nicolas," he said in a whisper to Teresa. "And if he can, he'll come, right?" She replied with a sad smile. "In a way that we can't see, but we can feel, and that's enough." Santiago nodded. I had already understood that not every presence needs to be visible to be real. The birthday arrived with bright sunshine and the smell of cake in the air. Teresa woke up early to prepare everything, while Ernesto went out to get balloons and number-shaped candles. Santiago helped with everything, placing the cups on the table, checking the invitations he had made himself with a marker. Neighbors, some schoolmates, and even the teacher came, who was moved to see the boy so at ease, surrounded by people and smiles. Ernesto, in a silent gesture, hung a portrait of Lucia and another of Nicholas in simple frames on the sideboard next to the cake. No one commented, but everyone noticed. During the congratulations, Santiago closed his eyes for a few seconds before blowing out the candles. Then he said he had made a wish for this day to never end. Teresa almost dropped her soda when she heard this, because there, at that moment, everything made sense. Later, when the guests had already left, Santiago ran to the room and came back with an envelope that he kept hidden in the drawer. He handed it to Ernesto with trembling hands. "It's a gift from me." Inside was a drawing, another one, but different. It was their house, seen from above with open windows and two hearts drawn on the roof. On the floor, a puppy slept next to a boy and a seated man. In the sky, clouds formed a smiling face. "It's you, me, and Mommy up there." Ernesto looked for a long time before saying anything. Then he got up, grabbed a nail and a hammer, and hung the drawing on the refrigerator door, as if he were marking the beginning of a new era. Santiago smiled. Teresa, from the door, watched in silence. And, once again, he understood. That was the family that time tried to destroy, but love insisted on rebuilding. In the days that followed the party, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Santiago slept better. His nighttime crying fits had diminished, and even his nightmares had become rarer. Ernesto went back to work part-time, but he made a point of getting home before sunset. There was always something waiting for him, a new drawing, a difficult question, or simply a silent hug in the hallway. Teresa, in turn, began to take better care of herself. She started going to the Sunday market with friends from the neighborhood, resumed her embroidery habit, and even took out of the drawer an old letter that Lucia had written to her, and that until then she had never had the courage to reread. The letter spoke of fear, of love, and of a baby that she still didn't know how to raise. Teresa read it to the end and cried as if cleansing her soul. She put the letter back, now with a different weight, a different peace. One night, while Santiago slept on the couch, his head on Ernesto's lap, Teresa sat down in the armchair and said something she had been keeping in mind for days. "You know that, for him, this is heaven, right?" Ernesto stroked the boy's hair, looking at the switched-off TV. "I know," he replied, "and somehow it became heaven for me too." The silence that followed was a good one, the kind that doesn't bother, that completes. Outside, the wind passed lightly through the trees, and one of the windows creaked slowly, as if someone were peeking in unintentionally. Teresa smiled, looking at the scene before her, a rebuilt man, a whole boy, and a house that was home again. She thought about Lucia, about Nicholas, about everything that had been lost, and most of all about everything that had been found again. At school, Santiago became a different child. Previously shy and quiet, he now participated in class, asked questions, and invited his classmates to play during recess. During a meeting, the teacher told Ernesto it's as if he had finally found his place in the world. Ernesto didn't respond right away. He just smiled and thanked him. And at night, when he went to put the boy to bed, he told him this phrase. Santiago, already under the covers, replied, "It's because now I have a place to go back to when class ends." And that stayed in Ernesto's head, hammering away, because perhaps that was the simplest and most beautiful definition of home. Not walls, not furniture, but a place that waits for you at the end of the day. A space where you can be small, make mistakes, learn, and still be loved. One morning, while they were having coffee together, Santiago asked, "Dad, do you think we are a real family?" Ernesto stopped stirring the sugar and looked into his eyes. "I think we are more than that," he replied. "We are a choice that worked out." Santiago seemed to absorb those words as if he were recording something important. Then he got up from the table and went to get his backpack, but before he left through the door, he ran back and kissed his father on the cheek. Teresa, who was putting away the dishes, pretended not to see, but she dried her eyes with the dish towel. That day, Ernesto arrived at work with a piece of paper in his pocket, the same drawing of the house with hearts on the roof. He kept it like someone carrying a talisman, because deep down, that's exactly what it was, a scribbled piece of paper that reminded him every day that he had come back to life. As the months passed, Santiago's features changed. He gained a little weight, the dark circles disappeared, and his eyes became brighter. She no longer cringed when talking to strangers and laughed easily. Teresa said he was stretching like beans on cotton. Ernesto, more discreetly, began to keep clippings from his growth, his first school ID, his report card with good grades, his first works of art. One night, he put up a little bulletin board in the hallway and stuck all of this on it. Santiago woke up in the early morning to drink water, saw that, and stood still for long minutes. The next morning, he said simply, "He is the best runner in the world." Ernesto smiled. "I didn't need anything else." That silent recognition was worth more than any diploma you've ever hung in your life. Teresa, between one task and another, began to write a notebook of memories. "I didn't tell anyone, but there I recorded every change, every beautiful gesture, every unexpected phrase." She felt she needed to keep this to herself, maybe for Santiago in the future, maybe for herself. On one of the pages he wrote, "This house was once silent. Today, it is history, and they don't know it, but they are saving each other every day." On another, he pasted a copy of the first drawing of the tree. It was his reminder that new beginnings exist. Sometimes they arrive shy, with bare feet, dirty hands, and hunger in their eyes. Sometimes they appear in the form of a boy who just wanted a piece of bread and ended up finding a family. And she, who thought she had already experienced everything, learned from them that love has no age nor an end point. One bright Saturday, as they watered the garden together, Santiago pointed to the tree at the back of the yard, the same one he always drew. "We could plant one more," he said. Ernesto looked at Teresa, who smiled slightly at the suggestion. They went to the neighborhood flower shop, chose an IPA tree sapling, and dug a hole in the ground together next to the old tree. Santiago wanted to write a little sign, "Tree of New Life." Teresa painted the name with white paint, and the three of them stuck the stake in the ground as if sealing a pact. That night, after dinner, Santiago approached Ernesto with a sketchbook under his arm. "I made one more." On the paper there were two trees side by side, and between them, three figures holding hands. In the sky, a cloud smiled, clearer, more alive, as if everything had now found its place. Ernesto hung this new drawing on the front door, as if to say to anyone who arrived, "Something that has been rebuilt lives here." Since then, every person who visited the house was greeted with this colorful and simple notice. Santiago, now with longer hair and an easier laugh, would pass by there every day and touch the paper with his fingertips as a reminder that this was indeed his home. Teresa said that the miracle was not in the DNA, nor in the signed papers, but in the daily decision to care, stay, and love. Ernesto, silent, knew this. And in that previously empty house, it was now possible to hear new things. Running footsteps, loud laughter, pots banging, music on the kitchen radio. Simple sounds, but they said it all. There, a new story was being lived. On Christmas Eve, Santiago woke up before everyone else. He put on the red shirt that Teresa had left folded on his bed and ran to the living room where the tree decorated the corner with twinkling lights. He sat on the rug and looked at the presents, but didn't touch any of them. When Ernesto appeared at the door with messy hair and a coffee in his hand, The boy turned and said, "This is going to be my first real Christmas." Ernesto sat next to him and put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Mine too." Teresa, who was coming from the kitchen with the tray of French toast, heard and stopped for a second. She watched the two of them there on the floor, in silence, and was sure that this was the most accurate portrait of life. People who had lost a lot, but who didn't give up on starting over. People who chose the other, and stayed. That night, after dinner, Santiago handed in his last drawing of the year. It showed a large tree, bigger than all the previous ones, with 3 smiling figures underneath it. Him, Ernesto, and Lucia, now with serene and clear features, looking at the two as if silently blessing. Teresa appeared nearby with a, "You finished frame. I think this one deserves to go on top of the shelf." And it did. Before going to sleep, Santiago asked to pray with Ernesto. He thanked him for the food, the new tree, the hugs and the stories they had told. And then, in a whisper, he added, "Thank you for choosing me, even without knowing it." Ernesto didn't respond with words. He simply squeezed the boy's hand, and there in the darkness of the room, he knew with absolute certainty that he would never be alone again. Months later, during a lazy autumn afternoon, Santiago asked to revisit the old drawings stored in the cardboard box that now sat in the hallway closet. They sat together on the living room floor, he, Ernesto, and Teresa. They laughed at their first clumsy attempts at drawing people, were moved by the scribbles from their quieter phase, and were surprised by how different everything looked now. At the bottom of the box, that first drawing reappeared, the tree with 3 figures and the clouds smiling. Santiago picked it up carefully, ran his fingers over the faded lines and said, "That was the first day I felt like I could stay." Teresa narrowed her eyes. Ernesto pulled him into a hug. The drawing went back on the refrigerator, now with a new heart-shaped magnet. And there it stayed, like a marker, like a silent promise that even with all the losses, it is still possible to find a way back. Santiago's history was not marked by great speeches or theatrical gestures. It was made of small, welcomed silences, of shared meals, of doors that remained open, and above all, of choices, daily choices to stay, to care, to believe that love can indeed be rebuilt. Ernesto did not replace Nicholas. Teresa did not heal all wounds, and Santiago still had questions that might never be answered. But there, in that previously empty house, a family was rebuilt, not by blood, but through affection, coexistence, and the courage to make space for others. And if today someone asks Santiago who he is, he answers without hesitation, "I am the son of Ernesto, grandson of Teresa, and a designer of happy trees." Because in the end, maybe that's what we're all looking for, a place where our roots can grow in peace. And if this story touched you, activate the bell and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Stories like Santiago's deserve to reach more people.